Thank you all for joining the JACC Heart Failure Virtual Journal Club. This is a second in a monthly series that we'll be having. And I'm really excited about our panelists today and what we plan to discuss, the LIFE trial. We're pleased to have Dr. Eugene Braunwald, Distinguished Hersey Professor of Medicine, Harvard Medical School, and the chair of the NHLBI Heart Failure Network, and co-PI of the LIFE trial, and Dr. Doug Mann, Professor of Medicine, Washington University, and Principal Investigator of the LIFE trial. And we have our distinguished associate editors from JACC Heart Failure with us and some of the investigator leadership from this important trial. This trial was published simultaneously this month as a design paper, a very important paper that we will get into the discussion as you see the outline here. Before we get into the paper, let me just give you a little bit of an overview of JACC Heart Failure. Next slide. Next slide. And so next slide, please. So this is our distinguished team that is on the call today, and we've added some additional associate editors during this time where we've seen a real uptick in the number of papers that have come to all the journals. And I'm really excited to have this panel here as discussants of this paper. Next slide. One of the things that we emphasize in JACC Heart Failure is clinical science. And you can see here, these are the top content areas of JACC Heart Failure. Ranging from pharmacology all the way down through clinical trial methodology, as we'll talk about today. Next slide. We have a number of innovative initiatives at the journal that you are familiar with. One of the ones we're very proud of is the Dead Letter Office, in which we invite clinical trials that haven't been published recently to have a forum to be published. And as you can see here with the flesequinone trial, this was conducted 26 years ago, and we were able to get it published and into the public to be transparent about the work that people do. We also have a feature, a patient perspective, that is very popular with our readership and audience. Next slide. We have about 1,000 submissions a year to the journal with an acceptance rate of 9%. And again, the top articles fall into these domains, ones that you might recognize. And we have a broad representation across the globe, about half the papers coming from North America and half from the rest of the world, as you can see. Next slide. And here just recently we show some of the most shared, downloaded papers, and lots of interest in medical management. And as you can see, new therapies. We talked about omecamtiv mecarbil at our last journal club when John Tierlink is on the call today. Next slide. So this is the topic today, is the design paper of the LIFE trial, sacubitril valsartan in advanced heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. This is the rationale and design of the LIFE trial. Next slide. And we're very fortunate, as I said, to have our two distinguished colleagues here to present this trial design. And then we're going to open it up to a panel discussion from our associate editors. And Patrice Nickens, also very important from the NHLBI in seeing this trial through. So we have the slides we can advance, Doug, if you'd like. Next slide.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Anyway, so the rationale for the LIFE study. So first of all, thank you for choosing our paper, and thank you all for accepting our paper. We're really honored and privileged to have it be in JACC Heart Failure. The rationale for the trial really was, I think all of us were sort of totally impressed with the results of sacubitril valsartan in the original paper. But when we looked at the paper, there weren't a lot of patients with class 4 heart failure or class 4 heart failure symptoms. And this is really probably one of the more difficult groups of people to take care of, as everyone on the call knows. So the rationale really is that less than 1% of the people in the trial, at Paradigm trial, actually had class 4 heart failure symptomatology, and therefore we thought that is it appropriate to get additional expertise, and particularly to see whether outcomes and tolerability were impacted by sacubitril valsartan. So the hypothesis really was in symptomatic heart failure with reduced ejection fraction treatment with sacubitril valsartan for 24 weeks would improve NT-proBNP levels, which we thought reflected hemodynamic and clinical status versus treatment with valsartan. The design actually, I think, is a pretty interesting design. So it's obviously randomized, it's double-blind, double-dummy, and the active comparator here is sacubitril valsartan as opposed to an ACE inhibitor, and we can talk about the rationale for that later. There are 3 parts to the study: the initial screening period, and then there's a run-in period for 3 to 7 days. This can be done either as an inpatient or an outpatient, which is another unique aspect of the study, I think. And this is really just to see whether the patients tolerate sacubitril valsartan. And then the study treatment is then up-titrated to achieve target doses of 200 milligrams PO/BID or valsartan 160 milligrams PO/BID. So next slide, please. And again, this is the rationale that in Paradigm, less than 1% of the New York heart, the patients in the study had New York heart failure class 4 symptomatology. Next slide, please. And again, if you just look at, and this is presented by John McMurray at the 2016 AHA scientific sessions. I don't know that it ever made it into a paper, but this really shows you the lack of confidence, if you will, in the efficacy and safety of sacubitril valsartan in patients with class 4 heart failure symptomatology, both for heart failure hospitalizations and CV death and heart failure hospitalization. You can see by the broad confidence intervals that we really don't know whether this drug works or not. Although it was FDA approved for class 4 patients, the practice guidelines currently don't endorse the use of sacubitril valsartan for patients with class 4 heart failure. So again, we thought that this was an evidence gap in our knowledge base, and we thought that the LIFE trial would be helpful in terms of filling that gap. Next slide. And the primary endpoint of the trial, and we can discuss this, is the proportional change in the area under the curve for NT-proBNP levels measured at baseline and at weeks 2, 4, 8, 12, and 24. Next slide. There are a whole host of secondary endpoints that I think are clinically relevant. Really 2 major secondary endpoints. One is a clinical endpoint, the number of days alive and out of hospital and free from any of the following events. And I apologize about the wording, but this is the UCRI wording here. So free from the following events: listing for cardiac transplant, status 1 through 4, cardiac transplant itself, LVAD implantation, or started on continuous inotropic therapy for greater than 7 days. The tolerability measures are shown below here, and I actually think will be really helpful for understanding how this drug can be used in patients with class 4 symptomatology. The number of patients achieving a target dose of 25, 50, 100% of valsartan or sacubitril valsartan. Number of patients developing hypotension, number of subjects developing worsening renal function, and the number of subjects developing moderate or severe hypoglycemia. We actually think that this data set is really going to be one of the more important data sets for the trial. Can I get the next slide, please? This is the central illustration, just illustrating the different phases of the trial. As I said, there's a screening period where eligibility is confirmed. Then there's a 7-day period before beginning the open run-in. It can actually be done earlier than that. We want to see whether the patients will tolerate a dose of sacubitril valsartan at 50 milligrams PO/BID for 3 to 7 days. And then the patients are randomized in a 1-to-1 fashion to receive sacubitril valsartan versus valsartan. And then the drug is up-titrated. The study visits are shown below. and the total period of treatment is 24 weeks. So any questions on that from the group before I go to the last slide and we open this up for discussion? Okay, hearing none, let's just go to the last slide. So this is, I think, one of many trials that will be impacted by COVID-19. And I didn't realize that was going to garner the excitement of the editorial board, but I think the way in which this was handled, which I really have to give credit to Dr. Braunwald, who saw this coming long before any of us. So we had first patient randomized in February 2017. We had a DSMB interim analysis looking at the first 200 patients. They gave us a green light to go ahead and continue with the study based on what they had seen. There were no safety issues that were identified, and they didn't really do a futility analysis, but they told us to continue. Based on what was happening in the community, the executive steering committee, and Patrice was a part of that, Adrian Hernandez, Dr. Braunwald, and myself, we thought that it was not safe to bring patients back to the hospital for screening visits. So at that point, we stopped enrolling in the trial. And then upon further reflection, I think the decision was made to actually cut the primary analysis short for patients who had been enrolled on or before December 7th, 2019. And the rationale for that was that we thought we could collect all of the data on those patients, and the data wouldn't have been impacted, particular hospitalization data wouldn't have been impacted by COVID-19. We continued to randomize another 30 patients that had already been in the mill. Those patients will be included in a secondary analysis because we want to share all of the data with the community. But in terms of having a pristine data set, the last patient will be enrolled before December 7th, 2019. This had a minor impact on the overall power analysis, but I think it was really the appropriate decision based on where we were. And, I'm part of several trials as everybody else is on the call, and I think all of them have been impacted by COVID-19, and particularly hospitalizations, and we can discuss that because I think it's really interesting. But anyway, this is the timeline and how COVID-19 affected the trial and the decisions that were made by the executive committee in terms of what was best for the trial to provide the most information. So I'd be happy to take questions or open this up for discussion. Adam, you were key in many of the handling of the patients. Did you notice anything with COVID-19 in terms of the call center and study coordinators calling in and whatnot?
One anecdote, I actually had clinic yesterday and saw a patient enrolled in the study, and she was quite sick when she came to clinic yesterday. Had kind of been doing everything possible to stay away from the clinic and everything else. So yes, it definitely happened during the trial, and I think we'll kind of see the full repercussions of that, over time as we start to see how this really impacted heart failure care. But yes, definitely saw that.
So let me ask Dr. Braunwald to comment. This trial really could be called 9 lives or a cat with 9 lives. There was a challenge at the start. Recruitment was always a challenge. You guys completed it, and then COVID hit it. As a trialist, Dr. Braunwald, give us your reflection on challenges of this trial.
Well, so I was present at the Paradigm Heart Failure presentation that was at the ESC in Barcelona, and it was a beautiful presentation, and everyone was very, very excited. They thought a new dawn had arrived in the treatment of HFrEF. And I rushed to the Novartis the suite, which I had cased out before, and got on a long line of people who wanted to talk to the senior executives at Novartis. And what I told them when it was my turn is that this is fantastic. This is the most important thing that in heart failure that I've heard in the last 25 years. However, there are two areas. These are patients with chronic, not advanced heart failure, and these are patients who are ambulatory and not hospitalized. And so we don't know about acute heart failure. We don't know about chronic heart failure that's advanced. And the long and short of it was we agreed to do two trials. One in acute heart failure, that's Pioneer Heart Failure, and JACC Heart Failure is in the process of publishing several of the trials. It was Eric Velasquez was the PI, and that was published in the New England Journal about 18 months ago in acute heart failure. And tough one is the one we're talking about now, the LIFE trial, and that was for chronic heart failure that's advanced. Now, why has it been tough? Well, when we started the trial, people were afraid of treating patients because with sacubitril valsartan, because there had been some instances of hypotension, and these are very brittle patients, as everyone knows, and so there was some reluctance. We set up a system where by the chairman of the DSMB, Doug Vaughn, who is at Northwestern University, former Timmy Fellow, would review the safety on a monthly basis. And he gave us a green light every single month, poor guy. And so that gradually brought more patients in. Then a strange thing happened. The problem became so many people were being treated with sacubitril valsartan, and although they would have been perfect for the trial, they came in and had been taking it. So that was obviously an exclusion criterion. So that was the second strike. So first, nobody wants to give it, and then everybody's made up their mind that it is beneficial, which we don't know, by the way. And then COVID came along. Fortunately, when COVID came along, we had, as you heard from Doug, 330 of our 400 patients. And we obviously decided to stop randomizing any new patients. So we do have 30 that were COVID touched, and they are not part of the primary analysis. So it's been quite challenging. I think that we're going to learn a great deal. The number of patients is small, but the detail in which they have been studied is enormous. So we're going to have last visit at around October 1 of this year, and it is our hope that we will be able to present at the ACC in March 2021. And we're geared to do that. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Person meeting, because we'd love to see everybody again.
Yes.
Let me ask Barry Greenberg, who was around in the SOLVE studies and even Consensus. Consensus had 250 patients, so you have more patients than Consensus. Barry, is this the right thing to do to try to go into the spaces that were not met in the original trial? Less than 1% were class 4 in Paradigm.
I think it's vitally important to do that. There's a real uncertainty in the medical community about the management of these patients. and this will provide the information that's really critical to us. The other part that I think needs to be stressed is the information about tolerability in this population. We know from CHAMP-HF that many of the medications that we have available for management of patients with heart failure aren't being utilized, and in many cases, this is related to physician concerns about tolerability. Here we're taking a cohort of very vulnerable patients and looking at tolerability of a drug in this population. And I think that the shadow that the data that's going to be forthcoming from this study casts will go beyond the specific population in which it's being studied in, so that it should give physicians some insight into how well this drug is tolerated in virtually all patients.
Dr. Januzzi, the primary endpoint. You've been an advocate of natriuretic peptides as primary endpoints. Can you discuss the endpoint and the methodology of analysis here?
Sure thing. Thanks for asking, and congrats to Drs. Braunwald and Mann on the design and execution of this challenging study. I'm an advocate for using indirect or surrogate endpoints when the biomarker, in this case, matches up in the biological pathway of the therapy, in this case, sacubitril valsartan. There are some therapies that induce a reduction in natriuretic peptides, which are very indirect to the biology of natriuretic peptides, but more and more data are pointing towards the effect of sacubitril valsartan as being, to a large extent, mediated by pathways that are directly intertwined with the natriuretic peptides. So, stated more simply, it's I think a good surrogate marker for success of therapy with sacubitril valsartan. So, in that decision, I think we should hopefully see, if we see what we expect to see, that the drug, in reducing natriuretic peptides, one could connect the dots to a reduction in adverse cardiovascular events. To be very clear, though, there are some therapies whose effects are not as well reflected in changes in natriuretic peptides, and that's going to be something that, moving into the future, we're going to have to think more carefully about.
Dr. Mann, why did you choose this endpoint?
So there are a number of pragmatic reasons for it. One was the longevity of the. So first of all, we thought of the endpoints that we had the ability to recruit for. This was the most robust one. Initial trial versions of the trial design had a hierarchical design, including the endpoint that I showed you, the secondary endpoint. But where we landed really was with the NT-proBNP levels as being something that we thought we would have sufficient power to achieve within the lifetime of the network, which was beginning to come to a close. So a lot of it was pragmatics. This is the largest trial that the Heart Failure Network has ever done. It probably exceeds the maximum number of patients that we've ever recruited by about 150. It required doing things that we had not done within the network before, such as partnering with Inova to get additional centers. So a lot of it was just pragmatics of a trial design, what we thought was a robust endpoint that would address the questions, with a lot of secondary endpoints sewn into the analysis that would be informative for the community. Ideally, doing a morbidity mortality trial would be great, but I don't think we really thought we'd ever pull that off in this group of people. Another thing that I think is really useful to bring out for discussion that came out during the trial was really how you define class 4 heart failure. I think everybody on the call would have a slightly different definition. My view is it's a lot like pornography. You know it when you see it. But trying to actually crystallize that and put it into a protocol where a study coordinator can recruit those patients is a little harder. And the thing I think that we learned from this is, class 4 today in 2020 is not a destination anymore. Patients go on to VAD, transplant, or other advanced therapies. So it's this ever-changing class of really sick people. But I think it was a little hard for us to also define those patients. Hopefully I've clarified the rationale for that endpoint and some of the difficulties we had. Gene, do you want to comment at all?
Yeah. Yes. I think I agree with you, Doug. Class 4 is not a stable class. If there are two things that can happen to a patient in class 4, they can die, obviously, or they can be stabilized, and they may go on to either transplantation or VAD. And so we spent a lot of time trying to define it. No class 4, and the requirement for eligibility was to have patients who had experienced bona fide symptoms of class 4 as defined by the New York Heart Association within 90 days of enrollment. That doesn't mean they were class 4 on the day that they were enrolled, but they had class 4 experience. And as we know, patients in class 4 tend to have repeat experiences in class 4 or worse. So that has sort of been an eye-opener. Class 4 is an unstable state, like there are certain chemical ions that appear for a short time and then go one way or the other.
We've got a number of questions. I hope maybe we could extend this 15 minutes beyond the 12:30 cutoff. Well, Dr. Braunwald, how old do you have to be able to call you Gene, Dr. Braunwald?
35.
You got to know how youngsters like to call
all the time.
Yeah.
John Tierlink, you've been working on a compound that we think will be helpful in advanced this population, maybe a little bit not quite as sick. This is a really sick population. You had a comment on the comparator.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that was really great about Paradigm is it provided an opportunity to actually, for the first time in a while at least, replace one of our therapies with a newer, better therapy. And so it's always hard to choose what the proper comparator should be in this regard. One of the exciting things I think about LIFE was that it was giving us a chance to see what the differential effect might be between valsartan and sacubitril valsartan. So we actually see what the addition of the sacubitril moiety might be, what that benefit might be. However, one of the other sides of it is, as far as I know, valsartan as an individual therapy isn't really considered the right therapy for patients with class 4 heart failure, and an ACE inhibitor is considered probably better and more indicated. So I know you folks had discussions about what the proper comparator should be, so I think it might be useful to share a little bit of that process with us.
Doug, do you want to take this or whatever?
Yeah, so John, we looked very carefully at the VALHAF data, and if I recall correctly, they did look at class 4 heart failure patients, and there was a benefit. I don't remember the error bars on that, but VALHAF did specifically address this. We did not feel it was unethical to randomize to valsartan in this population based on what we knew. And the other thing is that scientifically, we thought that we would learn a lot about actually how the drug works in this group of people by comparing it to valsartan rather than enalapril. But we did consider the optics and the ethics of looking at valsartan. And again, as going back on memory here, which is always dangerous, but when we looked at the VALHAF data, they had looked at class 4, and I do think there was a suggestion of benefit in that group of people. You probably looking this up as we talk and going to correct me, but we looked carefully at this.
Paragon used valsartan as the comparator, And I think that Doug has hit it. We wanted to know, what does sacubitril add?
That's great. Dr. Felker, you spent a lot of time thinking about drug development. Tell us your thoughts on this trial, and as an investigator and as someone who thinks about drug development a lot.
Yeah, well, I have some biases, obviously, as an investigator. As others have said, I think it's a really important study. One thing I thought was pretty striking in the paper was the table of other studies in this population, which let's call ambulatory severe heart failure. And what was striking about that is almost all those studies are 15 years old or older. So even though this group of patients is not going away, there's as many of them as ever. We've done a poor job of studying pharmacologic therapy in this group, partly because the results with inotropic drugs were disappointing, but also the rise of LVADs and other alternative treatments. And finally, just because it's hard, as we found, it's hard to study this population, but really important. So I think, this trial is going to punch above its weight in terms of its impact relative to its sample size, because there's so many critical aspects of this question that are going to be really important for other aspects of care.
Maria Rosa, what are your thoughts? You're on mute.
Yes. So I'm very excited about this study because I have participated in the Pioneer trial, and my experience with the patients that we enrolled in Pioneer was that when we enrolled them, we were only able to begin with the lowest dose of sacubitril valsartan, but once they were in the outpatient setting and still pretty advanced heart failure, I found that by tweaking and decreasing and even eliminating their diuretics, we were able to actually get all of them to the target dose of sacubitril valsartan. So one question I have is whether the LIFE investigators had some guidance as to which strategies they could use to optimize their ability to achieve the target doses.
So we didn't give specific guidance to the investigators. Things that were discussed in meetings and on call. Obviously, the first thing would be to be really judicious about your diuretics or backing off on the diuretics, when you're starting. But there was no protocol-driven guidance to investigators in terms of how to do this. I think, not to sort of get on my soapbox, but the Heart Failure Network investigators obviously had a lot of experience, and the INOVA people were also awesome in terms of being able to get up-titrate people with this class drug. But in answer to your question, Maria Rosa, there were no directives given to the investigators. Could I, Chris, just digress for a minute and go back to John's question? So in the few seconds that we had, I pulled up the VALHEF study, and they did lump class 3 and 4 together in their forest plots and showed benefit. Now, there were only about 2% of the patients that were in class 4, but in the VALHEF, when they did look at class 3 and 4 lumped together, there was a benefit for valsartan over placebo. So again, as I said, we looked at the ethics of this a lot and felt comfortable that valsartan was a good active comparator.
We have a number of questions from the audience. A question from Muthu, whose office is right around the corner from Dr. Braunwald, and he asked the question, historically, we have developed drugs in the sickest patients first. If you look at Consensus, if you look at Copernicus, if you look at RALS, and then moved upstream. And it seems like now we're going the other way. Do we think this is the right thing to do, to go in the more stable population first, then the sick? Or do you try to get the signal in the sick first and then move to more stable? Dr. Braunwald?
Well, I think the John McMurray and his group just hit the nail on the head. And so I think that they were very smart. They had a new drug. They had no idea whether it would be tolerated or not. They had a good run-in period. And so there was really, historically, sacubitril/valsartan never had a proper phase 2 trial. So that there was very little information about it. And therefore, I think they said, well, we're not going to start with the sickest patients. We want to see whether our patients can tolerate this. And about 12% in the run-in couldn't tolerate it. So they felt it was safe to proceed. And obviously, I think if they had started with a population such as the ones we had in either Pioneer Heart Failure or LIFE, it would have been a very, very more difficult slog, and we might not actually be where we are today.
This is Doug. So, and if you look at most of the recent trials, they're predominantly class 2 and 3 heart failure with very few class 4 heart failure. And I think Mike Tucker brought that up. If you look at the table that's included in the paper, not a lot of recent trials enrolled class 4 for many reasons. They're difficult to treat, difficult to find. So I think the trend used to be the sickest patients, and I think for device therapies, it's still the case. But most of the trials that I've seen, and maybe you guys want to comment on this, are really more in class 2 and 3 heart failure rather than class 4.
I think that certainly was the case with the introduction of ACE inhibitors, which I remember, and the introduction of beta blockers, and certainly of loop diuretics. Didn't start out with patients in pulmonary edema or patients who were very far advanced, but it was just a way of rapidly decongesting patients. So I think that seems to be a reasonable approach in heart failure. At least in HFrEF. In HFrEF.
In HFrEF.
Sure.
Tarek? Would you like to, is Tarek on?
Hey, Dr. Starr, can you hear me?
Yes.
I had two quick questions, so congratulations to the investigators. A lot of times in the clinical setting, what keeps me from starting people with advanced heart failure on Entresto is either hypotension or renal insufficiency. And I know those two factors were exclusion criteria for the study. So what percentage of the people who were screened had that phenotype of heart failure? As a extension of that, if we were to test SGLT inhibitors, which at least I'm using in that setting, would you do a similar study where you look at NT-proBNP levels in a randomized fashion? And the third question is, what happens if there's a signal for harm? We already know that Entresto is not being used as much as it needs to be. What would the authors say if it's found to have, a question of adverse events in this patient population?
Well, let me take the last one first, and ask Dart to take the tougher questions. I think that this trial has been very, very carefully followed, and by the NIH, by a DSMB, and by a chair of the DSMB who looks at the data every month. So I don't know about the efficacy in our patient population, but I don't believe that there's going to be a strong signal. The trial has been teetering for so long, it would have been stopped. Now, what we may see, and I think it would be very important clinically, we may see that a certain subgroup in this trial of 360 patients didn't tolerate the drug. And then we wouldn't say that the drug is useless. We'd say, be very careful in this particular group. I think that one of the things that we learned early in the experience, which I think everyone knows, is the best way to tolerate sacubitril/valsartan in patients who are very sick is to go down on the diuretic. And that makes a real difference in terms of the severity of the hypotension. If you eliminated the diuretic and they're still below 90, then they should come out of the trial.
Right. We have a question from the audience. Maybe, Adam, you could answer this. Is the breakdown of what medications and dosing range planned to be released for the GDMT therapy for patients?
Yeah, that links back to Tarek's question around kind of tolerability and what does the background therapy of these patients look like. So, yes, that was definitely captured, and it'll be part of the publication to be able to describe what the baseline characteristics and the background medical therapy was for these patients.
Cool. And Tarek, just address the run-in failures. We had about a 20% run-in failure in the trial. That figures about 310 patients enrolled. So, in a real-world setting with real-world patients without extensive screening, we had a run-in failure that I think suggests that these are really sick people.
And of course, we're going to describe in detail the patients who were enrolled and who were not randomized. And that's the group that Doug is speaking about. The data is going to come from the randomized patients, but we're going to have a very hard look at the patients who are enrolled and not randomized.
Well, that registry data would be very appealing to JACC heart failure. Hector, do you have a comment?
Can I send you the paper tomorrow?
That's maybe the associate editor. No, so I have one comment. It always surprises to me how, Doug was talking about 20% in the running period, how well these people tolerate these medicines. I don't, sometimes when people talk about inertia, people don't give the medicines and so on. And this population was sick, very sick. I mean, when you randomize the patients, they do well. I mean, obviously, we're going to see people that have failed, but the creatinine is a problem, the blood pressure is a problem, but you have a cutoff on that. And they tolerated it quite well. I'm surprised. And as a matter of fact, after they finish the 6 months, then you can put it back on Entresto, and they stay on Entresto. So we don't know anything about what the patient received in the next 6 months. So I found that it's very interesting how the research project can give medicines much better than in the normal world, and they tolerate it well. I'm very not surprised, but very interested about tolerability. It's amazing to me that it's that good. And even with blood pressures that are hanging in the 90, 100, and so on, and people do well. I'm sure I'm gonna assume that we're on Entresto, but I don't know, and so we'll see soon. But I think it's a very important trial in a population that is being absolutely neglected because of what Michael said in regards to VADs and transplants and so on. That would be my comment.
So, thank you. Gene, do you want to comment at all on that?
No.
Or do you want me to?
Go ahead.
So, I mean, I when we first started talking about this, my first thought was, oh my God, we're never going to be able to recruit for this because the patients won't tolerate it. And then when I would look around the room at the Heart Failure Network meetings, I realized that I was looking at some of the best heart failure investigators in the country, and then we were fortunate enough to get another group in Inova. I think this really speaks to the expertise and the commitment of the investigators in the trial to get patients on this drug and to do it safely. I'm really proud of that because these are sick people.
Absolutely.
The KCCQ scores are off the charts for many. So I I think it really speaks volumes about the quality of the investigator and the commitment of the investigator to getting the answers.
Absolutely.
And Chris, this is Mona. I was going to comment. I see a question from the audience about the cost effectiveness analysis because it's true that one of the biggest factors in the uptake of these drugs is cost. And, I work part-time with FDA, and it's really, once a drug is approved, it's out of the hands of the FDA. And one of the biggest problems we've had, particularly with Entresto, is the uptake for a number of reasons with payers. And so I think this study in particular answers a very important question that is not related to regulatory approval. And so maybe, Doug, if you could address the question about cost analysis or cost.
We're planning a number of secondary analyses for the paper, and certainly cost analysis will be one. Just sort of my back of the envelope calculation is Entresto is probably a whole lot cheaper than a VAD or a transplant. And then if you layer in the hospitalizations and the cost of a hospitalization, if we're able to reduce hospitalizations even 1 or 2 annually, I think it'll be very cost effective. But again, part of the rationale for the study is that we're really hoping that this could lengthen the time that people stay in that class 4 symptomatology window without needing advanced therapies or without coming back into the hospital.
I would add to that it is possible that that the results are neutral, and it is entirely possible that they're negative. And I think that is just as important because, as I mentioned earlier, now in the most recent, we stopped enrolling, but the last few months before we stopped enrolling, we were having problems because patients had been placed on sacubitril valsartan without this information. So I think it's will be useful irrespective of the results. Obviously, you always hope that you have found something that will be of benefit to patients, but if it's being given to people and it is not useful, then that's very important as well.
We'll have one last question, and then we'll have the co-principal investigators give their final comments. Maybe Dr. Fuzat and Dr. Sapka. I know that KCCQ was collected in this trial. If they were neutral, let's say they hit on the natriuretic peptide neutral in clinical events, but had a strong signal on quality of life, patient-reported outcomes, would this be enough to enhance the label for the drug? Dr. Fuzat?
I believe it would. We have the new FDA guidance. Obviously it depends. There are a lot of devils in the detail of that, but the new guidance indicates that quality of life is very important. Mitch, any comment on your end?
I agree. Quality of life is a labelable outcome, and this would be considered a labelable outcome if it came through. And I think that that would be a nice way to move the field forward as a demonstration project in the regulatory space to show that is a way that this can be done.
Well, this has been a terrific discussion. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Dr. Mann and Dr. Braunwald to give the final comments.
So, Gene, Dr. Braunwald, you should give I'm just going to show you how young I am.
Well, I think that most everything has been said. This is a difficulty with heart failure is we can treat patients early in heart failure and do better and better with HFrEF. But the course ultimately is a downward course. We all know that. I think that there are many patients who might be too old or have contraindications to an LVAD. And I think this is an important space, and we hope that we can contribute to an understanding of the pathophysiology
Absolutely.
and also come up with rational treatment for this group. Certainly, in the acute heart failure space, I think we did learn a great deal that I think is helpful. So I think now in the chronic heart failure is the next big step. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Braunwald.
Thank you, and please save us the front or second row of your presentation at the end. Everyone, have a good day, and thank you all.
Thank
the
you.
audience has been terrific with their questions, and
Appreciate
we'll
it.
follow up on those. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye.